Hello, my name is Owen. Today I'll be ranking my top 5 YA fantasy series of all time. And by all time, I mean the ones that I have read. And I haven't read a new series in quite a long time, so this video will serve two purposes. The first is to introduce you to some series maybe you haven't read. The second is to give you a glimpse into my tastes for YA, so maybe you guys can recommend some new series for me. But one thing I want to say before we get started, I feel like the YA fantasy genre in general is kind of like underrated or like misunderstood. Because a lot of people think it's just for like a younger audience and just for like kids, and it's just like the watered down version of like epic fantasy or like adult fantasy. But I think that's not the case. Great YA fantasy can be just as powerful, just as deep, just as dark in some ways as adult fantasy. The only difference is it's has less swearing, less F-bombs, and maybe less graphic descriptions of people dying. Other than that, it could hit all the same beats as adult fantasy. So I think great YA is in some ways harder to do because you can't rely on like the graphic nature of some adult fantasy. Which is why every series that I'm recommending today, I think, can be recommended to any audience of any age because they're just great stories. Full stop. So, starting off the list, actually, before we start off the list, you might see behind me we have the Harry Potter series. I'm not going to talk about the Harry Potter series for two reasons. One's smart, one's dumb. The first reason, the smart one, is because everybody knows what Harry Potter's about. And why would I waste time talking about a series that literally is like one of the highest selling books of all time? Waste of my time, waste of your time. Everybody knows what it's about. The second reason is I don't consider Harry Potter fantasy. And I know what you're thinking. It definitely is. And you're right, except for the fact it doesn't feel that way in my brain. Fantasy as a genre occupies one part, Harry Potter is in another. It's like calling, for me, Star Wars sci-fi. It's not that you're wrong, it just doesn't feel right to me. I feel like it's more like pop culture in general. So it just doesn't, I feel like if I'm introducing someone to the fantasy genre, I wouldn't give them Harry Potter. It's just a book. You know what I mean? Maybe you don't, but maybe you do. Anyway, I'm not talking about Harry Potter. Number 5 on this list is The Inheritance Cycle by Christopher Paolini. This is a very popular, famous YA series, and the reason I recommend it is I feel like it was a great introduction to like the feel of epic fantasy, the concept of many characters in many cultures and in large scale battles in the fate of the world and a new universe, or maybe not new universe, new like continent or whatever the scale of this series is. I haven't read the series in a long time, and I feel like it's number 5 because of all the ones on this list, I feel like if I reread it, it would hold up less than it does in my brain. I just remember reading this series and I felt like I am immersed in this world. Like I got the feeling, because I watched the Lord of the Rings movies at a very young age, and like I didn't understand what was going on, but I'm like, wow, this is crazy. Like so many orcs are running around. I got that feeling reading this book as like a young adult, and I'm like, wow, like the power of fantasy could like be so expansive. Like this man's creating like dragons, they have different names, and they could talk. I'm like, what is going on? It has a very classic fantasy feel. Like some people think like the Inheritance Cycle is very like derivative. It's like follows the very many same like story beats as like a Star Wars, like an orphan kid, he finds a magical power, he goes on an adventure. But in that way, it felt like very like comforting to me. It was a familiar story structure, but like introduced to a whole new epic world. So I think if you're not familiar with fantasy or like epic fantasy in general, I think it's a great, or at least in my memory, because like again, I don't know if I want to read it again. How am I selling this book? I like the series. It's my number 5 on the list of all time. It has a great epic feel, and its classic story structure makes it a very approachable, I think. I really botched that, didn't I? Listen, guys, I recommend it. It's on my list. Number 4 is the Percy Jackson series. The Percy Jackson series is the reason why people of my generation know way more about Greek mythology than they probably should. So it's a story about this kid who learned that he is a demigod, so like the son of a human and a god, and he basically gets magical powers, and he goes to a summer camp where a bunch of other kids have magical powers, and he goes on adventures. So this is a great series because it has like the Greek mythology aspects, and you learn a lot about like the Greek culture or like the ancient Greek culture and the mythology, and it's also just fun, lighthearted adventures. I feel like this story was like my first introduction to like the quippy, sarcastic main characters. Like they're kind of like joking around, they're having fun. And it's also a great series, kind of like Harry Potter, that like matures with its audience, I feel like, in a lot of ways. The journey from like the first book to the last book in that series, the last book is a lot darker and deals with much more like difficult themes of like loss and death and stuff like that, and like sacrifice, which the first book is more like lighthearted fun, like I'm a kid with magical powers, let me go on an adventure. But it's really a well-written series, very fun, very witty, and I really enjoy it. And also they're coming out with a Disney Plus show. So in case you want to read it before that show comes out, who knows if it'll be any good, because they came out with movies. Those movies are really bad. I liked the first one, kinda. Second one was like, I fell asleep. In the theater. It's rare. It's rare for that to happen. Moving on to number 3 in the list, we have The Beyond. Also, the Percy Jackson is by Rick Riordan, if you didn't know that. Number 3, we have The Beyonders series by Brandon Mull. This is another fantasy. This is a fantasy trilogy that like I read before I read a lot of fantasy. So the concept of this book is like a kid in the real world falls into like essentially like a pipe from Mario, and he like enters this random fantasy world. And this one really interested me to like the politics of fantasy. So he enters this world where it's like there's the emperor, or I don't know if he's the emperor, he's like a king, or he's like a guy in charge, and he's evil, and there's like a rebellion, but there's people, there's factions and stuff like that. And it just felt, again, kind of like the inheritance cycle, very, very complex to me. And this kid is like thrown into this world, and he has to like meet all these factions, meet all these players, and like the dynamics they have, even on the good guys, the dynamics they have with each other. And also like there's a prophecy and like doing all that stuff. And it's a great adventure. And also the first book ends in a great twist, which really like drives the rest of the series. And I think like it's a very, very solid trilogy. It's a very very approachable, very easy to read, like I feel like all great YA is, but also like, again, the complexity of the politics, the winding of the plot. It's one of the series where like you can't predict super easily where the series is going to go. And also, like Percy Jackson, really matures by the end. I feel like the third book has very, very dark moments. There's one moment in particular where this character sacrifices himself in this great like way. I can't spoil it, guys, but it's like, oh my god. It's like awesome. It's cool. It's sad. It's just like, okay, I can't talk about it anymore. But it's like it involves a fire pit. If you know what I'm talking about. Great series, highly recommend it. Brandon Mull is a great author, and you'll see why a little bit later in this list. Number 2, we have the Ranger's Apprentice series by John Flanagan. This is a very long series. I think there's like 9 or 10 books in the main series, but it follows like a boy who, when he reaches a certain age, has to like join like a guild of some kind. Like you could be a blacksmith, you could be a soldier, and he joins the Rangers. The Rangers are essentially like the secret service of this fantasy world. Like they live in the forest, they shoot bows and arrows, like they're the kings, like, okay, we got to deal with this like guy, like go take care of it, protect the realm, stuff like that. And it's a great story. One of my favorite characters in all-time fantasy is Halt, the main character's mentor. He's like gruff. He's like the reluctant mentor type archetype. But this is a great book, or great series rather. The stakes are high. There's very dark themes at times. Like the main character gets addicted to drugs at some point, and he's like pull himself out of stupor. He gets like prisoner of war, all this stuff, very dark. Deal with loss, deal with death. And then also the other great thing about the series is it takes you on a variety of settings in this world. You could explore a lot of this world. Like I said, it's like 9 or 10 books, and you get to like, it's one of those classic things in fantasy where it's like they visit the biomes essentially. So like there are books in the desert world, there's books in like the tundra, there's books in like this world's equivalent of like China, and like there's people running around there with like different cultures and different like weapon types and stuff like that. But I think it's a really great series, and because it's so long, you really get invested in these characters. And I think that the series concludes in a very satisfying way. And the best part is like the dynamics of like the main characters that we follow. Because in the first book, there's like 2 kids. Like there's the kid that is the Ranger's Apprentice. There's a kid that like is his like basically childhood bully, and like their relationship like keep like intertwining with each other, and they eventually become like very close. So I think it's like a great long-term series development of like character dynamics and stuff like that, and you will get extraordinarily invested in these characters, and I highly recommend it. And it's one of the few books that I sold at my garage sale this year, if you saw that video. So it's popular in some stretches, right? And this author has written a lot of books in this universe. I read his kind of like Viking-esque books. It didn't really click with me as much, but this main series is very, very good, and I do highly recommend. My number 1 book, top YA series of all time, is also by Brandon Mull, the author of Beyonders. It is Fablehaven. So Fablehaven is about this brother and sister who visit their grandparents, and it's revealed that their grandparents basically own like a wildlife reserve, but for magical creatures. So the first book is very much like them discovering the secret and like being able to see the magic creatures and like exploring it. But then the series like really gets very in depth in this world, in the concept of like other wildlife reserves, other reservations, and like the threats that are threatening the world. They want to break out into the real world. What are they going to do? Are they being hunted? There's evil forces at work. And it's just like a fantastic series. And I really don't know like how I can emphasize this. This is the series that I read again most recently. I think I read there's 5 books. I read through the series like probably 3 or 4 times in my life, and it holds up so well. It's such I wouldn't say easy, but it's a very approachable concept of a book. It's like, oh, kids discover that pixies are real. But then it's quickly like, the witch will curse you, and your brother turns into a frog, and like, what are you gonna do if your brother was a frog? It's like, oh, well, I don't know what I would do if my brother was a frog, because it's not like silly. It's like actually serious, and like I'm scared. And that's just the first book. But there is like aspects of like horror and like it gets spooky sometimes, and like all like the mythical creatures, and I feel like maybe like the Brothers Grimm aspects of them, like the concept of like mermaids that are like, mermaids aren't really that cute. They'll probably drown you and like eat you in the ocean or stuff like that. It has aspects of that, but it also has the aspects of like Tinkerbell-esque fairies and like, we're floating around. But it's also like, we'll also steal all your friends in your sleep and like and turn you into like a monkey or something. You know what I mean? It has like both aspects of like the whimsical, oh, it's beautiful, but also like the dark, like, don't mess around where you don't belong type. And it is YA, so it doesn't get super dark, but I just remember there was some moments where like I was like frightened as a child, and as an adult I was like, I'm entertained. So it's a highly recommended series by me. So if you had to read any of these, check out Fablehaven, guys. It's 5 books, and like I said, it scales in terms of like direness of the plot, but it's a fairly short series in the grand scheme of things, and I highly recommend it. As always, guys, thanks for liking and commenting on these videos, and I do ask that you give me some recommendations. I am interested in reading, I don't know what it's called, the Leah Bardugo, Six of Crows, because I watched the first season of that Shadow and Bone series, and I really liked those characters that I know are in that series. So I've heard good things about that, and I'm pretty sure it's classified as YA. I don't really know how YA it is, but the show was really good, and I liked the first season of that, so I want to check out that book. But books like that in general, as you can tell from my list and the way that I pitched Inheritance Cycle, I haven't read extreme amounts of YA fantasy, but these are the ones that I recommend. So when I said that these are the top 5 of all time, I guess it depends who you're asking, because if you ask me, they are my top 5 of all time, because I haven't read that much, and I want to get back into it, because like I said, great YA fantasy is just great fantasy.